So, a few of you are back again. What unbelievable commitment. You were there yesterday, now you're back again. So, let's rock and roll with some spectacles. Let me see if I can find the spectacles so I can read you. Vlad Tuju is saying, hey, Vlad, thanks for the redo. What do you think Putin wants to be written about himself in history books? He wants it written in history books that he propelled Russia from the back row to the front row of nations, that he was a gatherer of lands, and that he kept Russia together, which is hilarious because he is doing everything possible to maximize the chances of Russia breaking up, whatever those chances are. He's doing everything he can to maximize those chances, even though he would, of course, himself consciously deny that. Tough guy. How will Russian veterans and their families process their trauma and Russian indifference? Could this group lead to constructive politicization? Or is everyone trapped in the business deal paradigm? So, very often, politicization that leads to constructive outcomes doesn't start constructively. You've got to be realistic about that. It'll be the case often that there are a lot of actors involved, all doing very different kinds of things, and then certain change happens. When it comes to trauma, one difficulty for all of these soldiers is that you can't process trauma unless you understand what all the actors involved in the traumatic situation were doing. It's not enough just to understand your role, right? So, for instance, if you're walking down the street and you get assaulted, that induces trauma in you. A central psychic block will be a capacity to intellectually understand what the assailant was doing, but an incapacity to emotionally contain it and process it. So that it feels like it's not some kind of dodgy geezer Ricky who attacked you on the street, but it's sort of the world came after you, right? And then you wonder if the world's going to come after you again. So the problem for all of these soldiers is that they have literally no idea why the war is happening. They don't understand why Putin is doing it. I'm generalizing, but it's a generalization that's fairly accurate. They hope that he has some good reasons for it. They don't understand what they are. So the question that they'll be asking is, what was all of this for? And they won't be asking that question in the sense of, how were we ever justified attacking an innocent neighbor? No, they'll be asking about their perspective. Why were we sent into death and destruction? What have we gained from it? And if we haven't gained anything, can you point us to something the country has gained? And if you can't, we've got a problem. But at the level of trauma, their trauma can't be processed until they have some kind of understanding of what kind of situation they were in. Why was this war done? Who done it? What were they thinking? What made it come about? And all of that is opaque. And I'm afraid is likely to remain opaque to most of these people forever. So it's going to be very, very difficult for them to process their trauma. The regime will try to be clever about this. The regime talks about integrating these people into society, making them, fast tracking them into a position of authority and at least symbolic significance, if not actual influence. But while the regime is doing that publicly, it's very, very key to always also just insulate the rest of the country from these people and make sure they don't really gain any significant positions of power. Ross, it's been reported by British intelligence That British intelligence told Americans that Putin and his coterie mock Trump and consider him a buffoon. If those reports reach Trump, how do you think they'll affect him? They won't affect him at all. He won't believe that Putin calls him a buffoon. Because this mutual elevation of himself and Putin into a fantasy society to which only the two of them belong is very established, very important for Trump. It's not going to be shifted by that. So it's not going to touch it. Does Putin actually think that Trump is a buffoon and a loser? Yeah, he does. But it's not entirely. I mean, he also has a kind of strange reverence for Trump because Putin has reverence for anybody who rises to such high office in the United States. And he has a degree of reverence for Trump's capacity to, keep on breaking the system. So Putin has mixed views about Trump, but he certainly is partly um, dismissive of Trump as a man of political seriousness. Olga, have you seen Steve Rosenberg questioning Lukashenko about political prisoners? Yes, I did see that clip. After the war, um, Benedict is asking, if the economy in Russia is slow to normalize and peace is seen as betrayal, will red-brown politics reemerge like that of the 2010s? What will follow the Putin regime, when the Putin regime collapses, is highly unlikely to be something we would call particularly democratic, on the one hand. On the other hand, the ideological materials of the Putin regime are not terribly sustainable. They are dependent on a kind of quasi consensual indifference from the majority of the depoliticized population. So I don't believe that it's going to be possible to ideologically carry on Putinism without letting go many parts of it. I also don't believe that what we might call the Z radicals now, that's to say, people who want more war and more effective war, and perhaps have a constituency in the country of about 10-15% support, certainly under 20% support. I don't believe that constituency can become a majority constituency in Russia. If anything, they are in a kind of parasitic relationship with the Putin regime, and that once it goes, that constituency itself might partly dissolve. Now, exactly how all of this looks depends on what happens on the Russian space. I do think you're going to see a lot more extremity and radicalization if the possible, let's say, but not likely scenario of a major breakup of the Russian Federation occurs. Then you're going to see all kinds of extremities. And here, in part, the Russian Civil War is a good model for us to refer to. Armory Cat, what's the prospect of North Caucasian fighters from the North Caucasus sent into Ukraine returning after the war and being unable to reintegrate into society? Well, from some parts of that part of Russia, including Chechnya, the mobilization was actually a bit selective. I think you're going to find that the biggest question for that region is how Kremlin handles the post-Kadyrov transition in Chechnya. At the moment, the Kremlin has the power to control that transition. The Kremlin doesn't have the power to control the post-Putin transition, but it has the power to control the post-Kadyrov transition if it occurs in the next year or two. So a lot will depend on what happens next in Chechnya. And if what happens next in Chechnya doesn't happen soon, then the Kremlin's capacity to influence it will be reduced. And it'll be harder for the Kremlin to keep if you like, politicization in that region down. And of course, one of the questions for Chechnya is not just do we want independence from Russia? It's also do we want to join Russia? Because in so many ways, um, it is a space on which the Kremlin's monopoly of organized violence doesn't apply. It's in many ways an independent territory um, that is also enormously heavily dependent in other ways, enormously heavily financially dependent on the Kremlin. But the Kremlin doesn't get to say everything that happens there. So that transition is what we're going to follow. Stapidis, how much better would Gavin Newsom be for Ukraine? Enough to reverse the course of the war? No. But much better. But no. But much better. But no. So in other words, it's important for the Ukrainians and the Europeans to understand that some of the trends that are emerging with Trump are going to be irreversible, even if we have 3 consecutive Democrat presidents. There's a pattern of withdrawal there that's not going to be entirely reversed, and there's a pattern of redefinition of the previous global role that the United States had onto something more delimited, and arguably also more regional, concerned with a conception of a more local sphere of influence. So some of these patterns you are seeing won't go away. And of course, the central pattern that you can't do foreign policy well if your democracy is in crisis is certainly not going to go away, right? If Gavin Newsom is president, a third of the country is not going to recognize him as being quite legitimate. So it's going to be better, but fundamentally reversing the course of the war. I mean, don't forget, it's available to us to have a look at how the course of the war was going under Biden, right? It was better, but it wasn't fundamentally a different picture. It wasn't, put it like this, it wasn't fundamentally a picture of putting Ukraine in a position where it's got enough resources to what we might call win the war. That's to say, push Russia back sufficiently for Russia to enter some kind of crisis, and for Ukraine to keep all of its territories, with the exception of Crimea, or maybe even regain Crimea. We were never anywhere near that reality under Biden. So no, you're not going to see a major reversal of course for Ukraine. You're going to see basically the same situation. You're going to be seeing pressure for a peace deal, and then maybe putting Ukraine in a slightly stronger position to negotiate the peace deal than what the Trump administration is prepared to do. How do you talk to people who are apparently not reachable by moral issues and think that caving to Russian demands, they can have a better life? If you're talking about fellow citizens, then you just have to understand what their position is, not misrepresented when you engage with them, and present to them your position and present to them your non-negotiables. But your non-negotiables are not things that they have to believe, they have to share with you. They don't, because you don't get to control their minds. But you get to state clearly your position, and you get to vote and bring it about that certain people you don't want to come to power don't come to power. What you can't do is blast somebody into a goodwill perspective when they don't have enough motivation for a goodwill perspective. What you can't do is you can't blast somebody into a more rational perspective either. So you can't blast people into a more moral, into a more rational perspective, because if you like, the social power of reason and the appeal of an ethical perspective don't have their own police force that comes to enforce it, right? You make the argument and you're right about something, but I'm slightly bigger than you and just bonk you over the head. I win, you lose. In fact, you might get bonked over the head precisely because you've got something right. And that threatens my power, and I do something about it. Likewise, um, ethically, um, it might be that somebody should do something, but if that image, that thought is completely unavailable to them in their subjective motivational set, it's not even possible for us to say they have a reason to do it, because there's nothing internally to indicate that. So all we can say is that they should do it, or they should do it if there was somebody else that they're not. Hey Vlad, wish you better health from Germany. Thank you so much. Um, would you say we're in a second Cold War right now? So tags like First Cold War, Second Cold War are there to be explanatorily useful. So the question is not are we or aren't we in a second Cold War? There's no such thing as being in a second Cold War. It's just a descriptor we might apply to our reality if it's more constructive than unconstructive. I would say that we're not in the second Cold War and we won't be in it. But somebody could argue back. I mean, for instance, um, Plokhy, the Ukrainian historian, thinks that there is more continuity between what's happening between Ukraine and Russia now and the Soviet project than I do. Because I am big on, and that would lead to the thought that in a certain sense, the First Cold War isn't really over. I don't think that thought is enormously constructive, because we need to recognize the specificity of the Russian challenge, of the Russian threat. And the Russians are a hard right regime, very different ideologically and institutionally from the hard left regime that we had during the Soviet period. And I think it would be a mistake to see them as a continuity. If you're a victim of both, um, that might be it might be compelling to see a continuity. You might say, well, it's Russian imperialism coming at us again. Okay, but Russian imperialism takes different forms, and exactly what form it's taking when it's coming after you in the latest instantiation is a really important question. If you don't get that right, you won't be able to defend yourself effectively against it. So one variable that's different is that the Russian regime is very, very different to the Soviet regime. Another difference is that there's a diminution of US power and a dramatic diminution of Russian power relative to what it was during the Cold War. So we're not in the same kind of world. We're in many ways in a world with mixed up poles rather than with two clear poles. And nor do I think you could construct a compelling picture arguing that we're in a dynamic with China that it would be helpful to call a second Cold War. But again, that's not because we're definitely not, and there is nothing useful in that perspective. It's rather that to use the term, you would need to argue that for all its advantages and disadvantages, the balance falls onto the side of advantages, and therefore we say, yes, it's more explanatorily useful for us to say it's Cold War 2.0. I think that the disadvantages there outweigh the advantages in that usage. Brian, has Putin's vision of what an acceptable post-war Ukraine looks like changed since the beginning of the war? Yes and no. It's changed procedurally. Um, it's not changed in the sense that Putin wants political control over all of Ukraine. He hasn't got a real interest in territorial control over Ukraine. Does fancy himself a bit as a gatherer of lands, but he doesn't really need that. He wants political control over Ukraine. So that's not changed. But what has changed is that he believes he's now made a very big concession, which is why he's thinking that the accusations that he is taking a radical, non-negotiable position are ludicrous. That's not my perspective or the perspective that I advise us to share in. This is Putin's perspective. So Putin now is open to the notion of a peace deal that leaves Ukraine, as long as he gets the rest of the Donbass or whatever he wants, it leaves Ukraine sovereign and independent, but with a chance for Putin to then later on undermine that independence and sovereignty. He wasn't open to that at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Now he is. And the question for him would be, is this a peace deal that's going to create enough toxicity and challenge and unsustainability for an independent Ukraine for me to say, yes, I'll take it? And if he isn't going to be given anything like that, which hasn't been on the table for him because Ukraine hasn't been anywhere near accepting anything like that, he'll continue the war. Hurricane, what would happen if Putin just died suddenly? This is an interesting question. It's important to remember that Putin is to the more radical side of the people who are around him. Let me remind you again that some people in Putin's circle may have done, but nobody in his Security Council who I can automatically think of would have started the full-scale war against Ukraine in 2022. Putin did it as a unique individual. So that's an important factor, right? There'd be no prospect of the so-called Russian opposition realistically rising to power. It's not entirely useless to reflect on the transitions post-Stalin to Khrushchev and the transition post-Brezhnev via Chernenko and Andropov to Gorbachev, where somebody radical and hawkish was followed by somebody more moderate. And what happened in both cases was that the new moderate person was put in place with the view that there'd be a figure that could be manipulated fairly easily, but it turned out they had a certain kind of strength of their own. It just wasn't a strength of the sort of maniacal and radicalized kind of their predecessor in the case of Khrushchev. And in the case of Gorbachev, it wasn't the kind of strength that said, I'm going to keep the Soviet Union no matter what, and I'll use as much violence as necessary. It was a kind of strength that said, I've got a clarity of vision about the East European space, and I've also got certain principles. And if they get excessively violated by some things I try to do, I'm just not going to do these things. I won't keep the union together if it takes me using so much force that an enormous amount of violence has to take place. So one scenario is that you get something less radical emerge from within the Putin circle and the Putin regime. There could be a bit of a rule by committee in that case, and that's partly what is often thought about in these circumstances when folks think to pick the weakest candidate and put him in and then try to control them. So you're essentially going to see the collapse of Putinism in many respects. You're also not going to see a process that Putin himself has orchestrated. Putin doesn't have the power to orchestrate a transition. um, from himself to somebody else, whether that's while he's alive or posthumously. So these are some of my thoughts. Um, we're basically going to have an unstable, authoritarian, but slightly less radicalized power that may not be stable. Let's have a look. Maybe there are some super chats. If Putin could go back in time, would he have done things differently, knowing what he knows now? If you ask Putin today, he would, without any shadow of a doubt, and this sounds so absurd to us, but it's because we're not instinctively empathizing with how far power, and particularly relatively unlimited power, convinces you that you're right. Putin today would absolutely say that he would do the full-scale invasion again in Feb 2022, even if it led to the outcome it led to. So it wouldn't be Putin's position, knowing what I know now, I wouldn't have started this thing. His position would clearly be, I would definitely do this all over again. I did at the beginning of it think that this could be settled in 2 or 3 weeks, or 2 or 3 days, or 7 days, or whatever. I now know that the odds of that were there, but wasn't likely outcome. I was wrong about that, but I wouldn't do anything differently. Um, Especially now when Putin doesn't have the extremity of stress he felt around the time of 2023 and autumn 2022. I mean, we actually were large numbers of this community needed to deny it for reasons of watching activist channels that denied it. But we were actually in the nuclear crisis in October, in autumn 2022. And certainly the Biden administration recognized that. So Putin doesn't have anything like that kind of stress now. So I wouldn't say he is doing smooth sailing. I think that he is fatigued and has to concentrate really hard to keep the show on the road, but is not feeling sort of overwhelming existential stress of the kind he was feeling before. So therefore he can say, okay, I finally found a position where I can sort of kick into cruise control. And as Mark Galeotti says, Putin is thinking, I don't need to keep this war going forever. I just need to keep it going for a week or two longer than Ukraine can. So as shocking as that is to us, as counterintuitive as it is to us, Putin would say, I would do exactly the same thing all over again, even if it meant that I'd find myself struggling at the beginning, that I'd find myself needing to do a so-called partial mobilization in autumn 2022, and so on. So that's absolutely a terrifying example of how power distorts perception. What do you think about the incongruity between the US involvement in a ceasefire and their lack of support for Ukraine? Well, Trump wants to, that's TK McClone again, good to see you from yesterday. Trump wants to end the war. And Trump thinks that the best way to do it is put a little bit of extra pressure on Ukraine. Trump is pissed because he'd like to put more pressure on Ukraine than he can quite get away with. Because there are mixed views about that in his administration, and also overall the balance of forces in American domestic politics restricts Trump to some degree in this. Ideally, he would like to just turn everything off that he can for Ukraine and then say, well, excuse me, now you've got to do it. Now you've got to make a deal. He can't do it. But even though his hands are partly tied, he is trying to put pressure on Ukraine. He's putting more pressure on Ukraine than he's putting on Russia. Now, that means that he is not terribly interested in a sustainable peace. A sustainable peace is a peace that is not going to lead to a second war, or is not going to lead to the collapse of the Ukrainian state as an independent sovereign state. However, because Ukraine is in a desperate position, but not yet desperate enough to just sign up to anything, um, Ukraine's non-negotiability on this is forcing Trump to reckon with the fact that he can't just finish the war in an unsustainable way, because Ukrainians are saying we're not going to do it. And even if we did it, our population would kick us out of power. So Trump also has to reckon with Ukrainian agency, and that's infuriating to him because he sees Zelensky as a kind of, quite frankly, unwashed um, person who's just walked off the street who shouldn't belong on any table of politics. He feels aesthetic revulsion for Zelensky, and it's ridiculous. I mean, and to some extent, he just empathizes with Putin's perspective that Zelensky is like a sort of regional governor who, has somehow come to power because things have got out of control, and order and control need to be restored. So that's difficult. I mean, but we're very far away from any kind of peace deal because the Russians are not interested in making significant concessions. And the Ukrainians are still robust enough to say we're not going to sign up to something that's going to destroy our future. Now, what's happening right now is destroying Ukraine's future. But if it means accepting a deal that's so pro-Russian, it's genuinely an endangerment of Ukrainian statehood in the medium term. Ukraine right now, for all of the mobilization crisis, for all of the other crises, is strong enough to still say, no, we'll fight for another year. Il Sophistic says, take care of your health. Thank you so much. Zonk says, you say people bear responsibility for their country's actions, good or bad. Is a second generation Pakistani responsible for the sins of the empire? Is Penelope Cruz responsible for the Aztec genocide? Is it possible to say that you belong to a group, plausibly? If it is, even if it's just a part of your identity that's 5 or 10%, it's reasonable to feel a degree of involvement, a degree of responsibility. If it's 1% of your identity, then you're just not going to feel anything. So this stuff is a matter of degree. I mean, look at me. I left the Soviet Union in 1990. I was 9. I moved to Israel for 4 years. Then in 1994, I came to the UK. Speaking Hebrew, by the way, is my preferred language over Russian by then. So I never lived in Russia. I don't really believe genetic ethnicity has much to do with it, but if you wanted to mention that, then on that I am about 50% Jewish, and the rest I am more Polish and Ukrainian than Russian. But I grew up in Moscow for 9 years in the Soviet Union. It wasn't Russia, it was the Soviet Union. So how much responsibility do I feel for Putin's invasion of Ukraine? Is it a huge amount? The answer is no. It's very, very small relative to the responsibility I feel for the Iraq War as a British citizen at the time. Relatively little indeed, even compared to the tenuous responsibility as a Brit I have for what's happened in Gaza because Britain supports Israel. But do I have no responsibility at all? I think if I left Russia at the age of 1, maybe I would have no responsibility. Having left at the age of 9, I've left the Soviet Union at the age of 9, I feel a tiny bit of responsibility, yes. But it's small. I mean, this is sort of, like 8% of my identity. I'm basically Western. I'm very alien to Russians. Even if I speak Russian, I'm very alien to Russians. Psychologically, they think, who is this person? Why are they uttering Russian sounds, but they're sounding like they're completely psychologically different to us? Um, I'm a West European, basically. That's what happens when you live at the age of 9. Could be different if it's 12, 14. These things really do make a difference. So I feel some responsibility, but it's small. What did that manifest in? It certainly manifested in a kind of uh, extreme perception of the insanity of this, and it manifested in I think in the opening weeks, probably a tiny sliver um, of the massive rage that the version of me who never left Moscow would have felt. So it's a very small part of my identity, but it's a bit there. And so I do therefore have a tiny bit of responsibility for this war. Yes, it's very, very small compared to the responsibility I have for the actions that Britain does, but I wouldn't say it's completely zero. So that's the piecemeal sort of where you've got to balance these things. Do I feel responsibility for stuff Britain did in the 19th century? Um, a bit. Um, but much more immediately, I feel responsibility for stuff that got done. I mean, here is the primary category. This is the class A for being responsible. Are you a citizen of a country? Are you living there and politically engaged when it does something? That's really the criteria, right? So for me, stuff I'm responsible for is, the Iraq War is a great example. I'm also responsible for how much my country supports Ukraine, if we're talking about Ukraine. So I absolutely feel that as part of my experience of political responsibility. Uh, so that's how you'd balance it. So quite certainly, no, you're not responsible for things that were done 500 years ago. Um, but you're not going to be able to draw sharp lines here. What I obviously don't believe is that you can come along to Canada or Australia or the United States and say, hey guys, you're not legitimate here because you came and attacked and displaced and ethnically cleansed the local populations and sometimes genocided them. Uh, you can't tell a plumber in Adelaide that they have no right to be there just because they came here on a boat and their family came there on a boat 150 years ago. That's ridiculous. That's a kind of hyper identity politics, woke, post colonial nonsense gone crazy. But, do you feel some responsibility for how you got there if you're an Australian? Yeah. Do you feel a sense of responsibility for the appalling uh, treatment of the indigenous population, which was ongoing until fairly recently? Yeah, of course you do, right? But you've got to balance this. Doesn't mean you are not legitimate person on the land there. So no sharp lines, but that's how you begin to do it. My father thinks Ukraine is about to win this. Is he delusional? Yes. He's not delusional if he thinks Ukraine could win this. But the reality is neither Russia nor Ukraine are winning this. Um, mm, but the only way Ukraine could properly win this if there's some kind of collapse in Russia. But is Ukraine on course to win this? No, it's not. Ukraine and Russia both on course to lose this, um, with Ukraine losing more than Russia in the short and medium term, um, and then Russia losing really badly in the medium to long term, and Ukraine, we don't know what's going to happen in the medium to long term. I mean, don't forget that this is not a binary. Both countries could lose. In 2200, it's possible that neither Russia nor Ukraine exist, right? So understand that you know uh, there are all kinds of scenarios here. But if by win you mean the liberation of all Ukrainian territories, liberation of Crimea, the security that Russia will never invade again, because the West has regained its power and can now protect Ukraine, and because some kind of collapse occurred in the Russian space, which, by the way, isn't a guarantee of Ukrainian security at all. Ukraine might be more insecure if Russia collapsed, because there could be 2 or 3 countries on Russian territory that could all want to threaten Ukraine. Now, that's far-fetched, but not far-fetched enough that we shouldn't talk about it as more remote, but still nevertheless an entertainable possibility. So that's how I think about it. I mean, what are the chances that Ukraine will liberate all its territories in Crimea in the next 2 years? Are they as high as 10%? No. Are they around 1%? Maybe. Could be. 1% is not zero, right? Russia could collapse. But if he thinks that winning is that, then he is delusional if he thinks that it is about to happen, as opposed to thinking that it's a remote possibility that is one of the possibilities that could materialize. Any thoughts on the liberal stream of destiny? No, I don't have many thoughts about destiny. I just know that there was some kind of thread going on maybe a year ago on his community's Reddit or whatever that is, that was saying that he should invite me to talk to him. Let's have a look, beautiful community. Would a civil war, goblin stomper in the Western countries spread to other countries? No, but especially if the civil war occurs in the United States, it would make calamities in other Western countries more likely. The United States does have a bit of a domino effect power here. How does one deal with anti-Ukrainian hate? It's insane in Poland currently. Well, it's very difficult. I mean, there's a lot of anti-Ukrainian hate now. A lot of people are very, very triggered by Ukraine. It's now year 4 of the war. They've wanted Ukraine to go away, wanted Ukraine to lose. They see Ukraine as some kind of concentration of unlovely globalist forces that concentrate the projection of declining Western imperial power in all kinds of malign ways. I'm afraid to say that the more all of us in Europe swim in authoritarian political waters, this rise of the ex-conservative right, Poland knows a lot about, and we're all coming to know a lot about, that's going to disinhibit more projection of destructive impulses onto Ukraine. So it's going to be more Ukraine hatred. And that's tricky because the support for Ukraine in the West is deep in pockets like your pocket here. Look at you. You support Ukraine deeply on the whole. Then in a country like mine, we have, in the UK, extremely wide support for Ukraine. Right? So it's not like Israel, Gaza, where people are conflictive and all over the place with so many provisos and qualifications in their stances. We're very clear in the UK on Ukraine. Recent polls would probably suggest that something like 90% of the population have a favorable view of Ukraine and unfavorable view of Russia. But it's not a priority politically, right? So supporting Ukraine is something that Brits are tendentiously very much in favor of. So it's quite broad support, but it's not deep support. It's not in the top 5 or even 7 political issues in the UK, support for Ukraine. So that's how it put that, and that creates this difficulty that um, uh, that most of the most visceral feelings about Ukraine out there risk increasingly becoming negative, even while majorities of populations support Ukraine in a sort of a weak way. That way gets stronger if you move into Scandinavian, and stronger if you move into some East European countries. But that's roughly what I would say. Cheryl is talking about Adam Kadyrov. I don't know what's happened to Adam Kadyrov. Um, quick question from Hussein. What do you think about a US decapitation strike on Iran? Um, well, again, when we talk about that, let me read the rest of the question. And do you share the sentiment of the West versus Russia, China, and North Korea? And do these countries' leaders think like this? And does this pull them closer? Just two very brief remarks. Um, it's not easy to decapitate the regime. Even if you decapitate the regime, it doesn't mean the regime goes away. Seen that in Venezuela. So you've got to be very careful about these fantastical thoughts that Western powers often have. And Trump is getting a bit giddy about Iran. We're clearly going to, looks like we're going to see some action there. And the motives are all mixed up. Epstein is also part of the motivation there. And also don't underestimate how much for Trump just doing something is in of itself a motivation. He wants to do stuff. Second part is do not underestimate the complexity of the relationships between these authoritarian powers. Russia's support for Iran is limited and not to be overestimated. And the degree of complexity and tension and conflict in the Russo-Chinese relationship is also not to be underestimated. China says they don't want Russia to see Russia lose the war. Mark says, what do they consider losing? They consider anything that destabilizes the Putin regime as losing. Gaffer, we said a little bit about what would happen if the Chechen fighters in Ukraine go home. We had some selective mobilization in Chechnya. The key conversation you'd want to have there is about the post-Kadyrov transition and whether the Kremlin can control that transition, which in the next year or two they can. In 5 years, possibly not. The role of the returning soldiers after the war we discussed. There will be questions asked about what was this for and what did we get out of it, right? There's a kind of fantastical um, thought that people are going to be sitting around in Russia thinking, oh, we committed all these crimes and we feel bad about it. Yeah, they will be. That's going to be the Russian liberal opposition that's not likely to approach power. What the real conversation is going to be about is what did they get out of this and who benefited? And if it doesn't look like we benefited, why didn't we benefit? That'll be how particular demographics involved in the war will think. Why does Putin think the West is orchestrating revolutions like the so-called color revolutions? But when he tried to use the same perceived formula, it failed in Ukraine in 2014. Well, don't forget, there is indeed Western influence that goes on. But you've got to be double-minded. There is Western influence, but this is also domestic democratic story. One variable here that's worth bearing in mind, and we said this on the live without questions yesterday, is that Putin does not believe in democracy. It's when you tell Putin, look, democratic politics generated that outcome. There's something bottom up about that outcome. He says, no, it doesn't work like that. I don't believe in democracy. It's just some kind of naive story. There have to be interests involved manipulating the situation. That's what he thinks, not just about Ukrainian democratic agents. He also thinks that about Mr. Navalny in the Russian opposition. Why is Mr. Navalny so persistently parasitic upon my power? Why is he getting involved in my elections? Who does he represent? And the answer to Putin is clear. He is a malign instrument of foreign Western interference in domestic Russian affairs. It's not that Navalny built a political party with grassroots root bases all across the country, and he had genuine support. No, he is a Western insert, right? And Putin is quite indiscriminate about how he frames the world in that way. He thinks Lenin is just a Western insert, a foreign agent who was brought in by the West to destabilize Russia. What would be the next steps for a stable peace if Russia is forced out of Ukraine? I think that's too strong a counterfactual. Because there's just no prospect as things stand of Russia being forced out of Ukraine, except for two conditions: some kind of serious collapse. I've frozen. Let me try to unfreeze myself. Some kind of serious collapse on the Russian space, or a dramatic increase in Western support for Ukraine. And if these two things occur, then you could see Russia withdrawing from all Ukrainian territory. I'm still working to get my picture back. But short of that, I don't think we're going to be, near that scenario. And the problem then is that the counterfactual just stretches us too much. What do you want? Well, you'd want Western powers being able to act effectively and in concert. But if they can do that, then they should be, stronger than they're currently being in their support for Ukraine. So it's a little bit like, what would the world be if the world were different to what it is, kind of question. Are KGB infiltration tactics the same regardless of the ideological window dressing? I think that the way the Soviet Union tried to influence Western powers is different to the way the Russians are trying to influence us. And that's much more post-truth what the Russians are doing, right? It's what we said in the propaganda video on the main channel. So there are differences. Thimble, thank you so much. Would you expect to be doing a similar chat on the 5th anniversary? The war as it currently is going on is unlikely to be going on in 2 or 3 years. Could well be going on in a year. But it doesn't mean it's going to stop. It just could be going on a lower power, because the actors involved may not have the capacity to carry it on the power they're carrying it on today. But that doesn't mean it's going to stop, right? So is Ukraine going to be in a dangerous and violent confrontation with Russia a year from now? Yes. What shape is it going to take? Is it going to have the kind of shape it has now? Probably. Will that be the case in 2 or 3 years? Probably not, but the dangerous confrontation is still likely to be in place. How much does Putin regret his decision to invade Ukraine full scale? Zero. He doesn't regret it one bit, even allowing for all of the instabilities and fears and stressful moments he went through. He was really terrified during the Prigozhin mutiny, and he was overwhelmingly stressed during the so-called partial mobilization in 2022. But power distorts your vision so much that he thinks that, um, as badly as it's gone, he'd have to do the same thing over again. It just the difficulty of Putin of this for Putin just proves to him how necessary it was to do this. Okay, so that sounds like Putin's position. That's a great question from Martin. Um, that sounds like Putin's position if you ask him now today that he'd say, I'd reinvade. But if you gave him the knowledge, foresight of hindsight, and then did that in 2022 before the full-scale invasion, would he really invade? Great question. Probably not, but don't underestimate the degree to which the answer could still be yes, even then. This is a regime security war, and you've got to take on the West at some point. So why not do it now? Because if I invade Ukraine, Western support for Ukraine will destabilize Western democracies at home. Hopefully, eventually they'll collapse. And I needed to reconcentrate power in my hands in 2022. I was positively losing power. I was positively being sidelined by the machinations of my own regime. I needed to do something to regain power back into my hands, even if my hold on it is now more fragile than it would have been before. So, probably not, but it's close. If you ask him today, then definitely he'd say yes. I would do it all over again. Yeah, Martin, you're re-asking this again in a kind of perhaps even more constructive way. If you take Putin in 2021, give him the knowledge that if he invaded Ukraine in 2022 in Feb, he'd be where he is today in 2026. Would he still do it? It's close. It's close. Marcus, hello. How safe should citizens in the Baltics feel? From full-scale Russian invasion, relatively safe. From a Russian challenge at a low threshold to Article 5 via the Baltics, less safe than your country's officials and the various intelligence reports that are public would tell you. Because what they underestimate is how far such an act would be a political rather than a military act for Putin. The point of doing that in the Baltics for Putin is not to conquer the Baltics, it's to bring it about that major NATO countries do nothing in response, and therefore um, sort of accelerate their disintegration on the international stage and domestically. he can be mistaken without being delusional. Maybe that's a question about that's going back to the question about my dad thinks Ukraine's going to win in the immediate future. So let's make a distinction between illusion and delusion. Delusion is worse than illusion. Um, Delusion is that you misunderstand the way the world is today. Illusion is that you roughly understand where the world is today, but have a completely unrealistic idea of where the world could go. And so paradoxically, you can sometimes find people like certain kinds of Marxists who are actually very low on delusion. They have a pretty realistic um, social analysis of where we are, but have then a very unrealistic picture of where we're going to go. And so they're very low on delusion, but very high on illusion. If Ukraine cannot achieve full territorial restoration without escalating the war to a NATO-Russia conflict, what is the morally and strategically defensible stopping point? Well, you're not going to have a joint defensible um, point strategically and morally between Ukraine and the West. Their interests don't converge. Right? Ukraine wants the West involved in the war directly. The West is committed to by no means ever getting directly involved in the war with Russia. In a sense, the question emanates sort of more currency if we asked it a couple of years back, when it was perhaps less clear what was going to happen, because what's stopping Ukraine's territorial restoration isn't Western concern of escalation against Russia. It's Western insufficiency of support for Ukraine for other reasons. It's no longer for escalation management reasons that we're not supporting Ukraine sufficiently. So in that sense, I think your question is important, but it certainly wouldn't cut to the core of the insufficiency of support for Ukraine. The closer you go back to the beginning of the war, the more pertinent your question is, the more it is absolutely at the heart of the matter, right? When the full-scale invasion occurred, the first thing folks in the Biden administration said is, the number one objective here is to stay as far away from a nuclear confrontation with Russia as possible. That was a bigger priority than Ukraine not losing for the United States. Do you understand Yiddish? Hebrew. I used to speak Hebrew as my preferred language for several years of my life, but I haven't spoken it for a long time and I've forgotten it. A couple of Israelis referred to me as having forgotten it for political reasons, because I'm critical of the politics of the Israeli state. But that's not true. I've just forgotten it because I haven't practiced it. And actually, just before I went to hospital for a month in April, Isaiah Berlin's literary executor, Henry Hardy, sent me some pieces Isaiah wrote in Hebrew to get my feedback on their significance. And I bloody struggled to read Isaiah's articles in Hebrew, to say the least. I basically couldn't read them. Any responsibility for what Israel is doing in Gaza? Cheryl is asking me as a UK citizen. Yes, via the UK, via my 4 years in Israel as a child aged 9 to 12. No. Do people living in democracies bear more political responsibility than people living in dictatorships? Yes, but don't forget that being ethically implicated is about different things, not just responsibility. Um, if you're very directly part of something, you're not just responsible, you can be blameworthy, and guilty for it, right? If my country supports what Israel did in Gaza a tiny bit, for example, I'm certainly not blameworthy for it or guilty for it. I'm responsible for it. So what we're trying to do is not contract, but in fact broaden the economy of ethical implicature. And what's very, very important to me, and my hero Bernard Williams was very, very passionate about this, is to understand that there's a whole range of ways in which we can be ethically implicated in something without being blameworthy. Um, I made this video on the main channel a long time ago, with some quotes of Thomas Mann, distinguishing political guilt from political responsibility, distinguishing guilt by association, which I say is a thing that doesn't exist, and responsibility by association, which I think is a thing that does exist. And some people made the criticism of that video, which is not a bad criticism, that that's a really valid point, Vlad, in principle. But in practice, when you say in public that certain people are responsible for something, a lot of people are just going to read that and say, oh, he's saying they're guilty. In other words, that public discourse doesn't tolerate the difference between the distinction between guilt and responsibility is too refined. And I want to push back on that, but I think it's a good criticism. Oh, I said to Cheryl, are you asking me about my responsibility for what Israel does because I'm a UK citizen? Then the answer is yes, a bit. Not as much as if I were an American citizen, because Americans, quite frankly, just underwrite what Israel does. So a bit. Any responsibility as a kid who lived in Israel, age 9 to 12? None. And then Gaffer Bob is just introducing another consideration. Because I'm half Jewish, could I feel some responsibility for what Israel is doing? Absolutely not. Could this be different if I identify with being half Jewish? Because being half Jewish is meaningless to me. Like, my relationship with what coffee I like is more relevant to my life than whether I'm Jewish or not. So I just don't experience myself as being Jewish at all, even though sort of on the genetics test I would be 50.5%. So 50.5% Ashkenazi Jew. No, obviously I don't. If I really thought of myself as being Jewish, would I feel some responsibility? Yeah, through that I think I would, but I don't feel Jewish, and so I don't. The appalling treatment of indigenous Australians is still ongoing, Vlad. Yes, but also there are some really endemic problems there. Problems of dysfunction in the community, problems of deprioritization, and there's a kind of a loss about what to do about it politically. But sure, yeah, it's a pretty dark stain on ethically conscious Australians. I was going to say Ukrainians. Yeah, I mean, Cheryl, back to your talk about responsibility. It's very important that it's possible to feel a tiny bit responsible for something. So we've got to be nuanced about this, and it's hard to do that in public. It's hard to understand that somebody can be only a little bit responsible for something, and it's also hard to understand somebody can be responsible for something without being remotely blameworthy for it. So I'm responsible for the Iraq war. I'm certainly not blameworthy for it. I organized and protested against it. Um, Andy's asking, could Ukraine hold on until a sea change comes? Ukraine can hold on, yeah. This is really difficult, but Ukraine can hold on. But don't expect an American sea change. Whether you get Gavin Newsom or AOC as the next president, um, don't expect a sea change. That's very important because this is not about individuals. Trump the baddie. Trump is there because big changes are happening in our political environment. He also is the cause of these changes because he accelerates them, but he is a product of them more than he is a creator of them. So I don't think we expect a big sea change. What we could expect is, if the war is still going on, Ukraine being put in a stronger position to get a better peace deal. But these are really fine matters of degree, not more than that. Is it possible to present, Marek is asking, strong Europe on the global stage as an idea of European citizens regaining their agency? No, it's impossible. Unless you are talking about them regaining their agencies as citizens of particular European countries. Unfortunately, European is not a political identity that holds. In fact, it's a political identity that's triggering massive anti-democratic backlash, right? So I feel European. I don't even feel I live in the UK. I feel I live in London, which is a city in a country in which other cities are Prague and New York. That's how big I think Europe is. It includes it certainly includes bits of the East Coast of the United States, but that's a cultural identity. It doesn't translate into a political identity. That's the problem with the European Union. It never had the possibility of attaining meaningful political convergence. And so, if you're talking about your political identity, not your cultural identity, it's probably going to have to come through the particular country you come from rather than be some kind of European political identity. Because if it's to be a European political identity, you need it backed up by clear mechanisms of power that operate coherently. We don't have that. We're a bunch of increasingly conflictive countries who take different emphases on a whole range of issues, and we're partly operating within this structure of the European Union that is to some extent working well, but is increasingly sort of a bit like a car with spinning wheels stuck in mud. We're going to see more of that from the EU. We're going to see more, not collapse, but sort of incapacity. Um, and so I don't think a European political identity is a solution to anything. European cultural identity is a good thing. What are the lessons we could learn from all the turmoil? Let's go 15 more minutes. From all the turmoil we're witnessing in the world. I'm having a hard time finding a personal growth amidst all the power struggle of our leaders. Your personal growth is not dependent on what happens in your politics. Nothing that's happening in your politics is stopping your personal growth. The shape of the political world is not there to be a rescue mechanism for the formation of your identity. You can be aghast, angry, overwhelmed, nihilistic, despondent about the political world, and these emotions can be overwhelming, they can be intense, but you don't want to allow them to form your identity or affect your personal growth. Because personal growth is something that's very importantly should happen under different political types of weather. We're moving from a period where the sun was relatively out for a couple of decades in Western politics to a period where there are going to be thunderstorms and rain. But that's not cyclone or hurricane necessarily, you know. We could have some cyclones, some hurricanes, but not necessarily the biggest ones you could get. But you can be absolutely hugely impacted by that. But I don't want you to feel that your journey of becoming who you are, your journey of becoming free, is dependent on this. It isn't. It isn't. A small practical step is to bring it about that you get some time to yourself to turn yourself off, to turn the world off, turn the political world off. I don't know what's possible in your life. It could be that a very short retreat is possible. If a short retreat isn't possible, you could literally just book yourself a hotel room for a day and just turn off your phone, turn off politics, and see what thoughts come to mind about what you need. And maybe you'll discover that you need some therapy, or that you need to adjust something at work, or that you're not being what you want to be in your family dynamic, in your relationships, and so on. But I don't want you to sit around and say, I'm not what I am in my relationship with my partner, or with my children, or with my parents, or with my friends, or with my colleagues because of something that Mr. Putin did, or because of something that the child monster in the White House did. They have a lot of power. Don't give them even more power than they actually have. Does Putin see himself in the same vanguard perspective, Laum is asking, as the Bolsheviks did, as an enlightened individual that has to do things that the population can't understand en masse? Putin is certainly very dismissive of the Russian population. He has a colonial perspective of them. He thinks, well, what are they up to? He is sort of demophobic in that sense. He's afraid of his population. Gorbachev once told Putin, don't be afraid of your people, why you keep introducing coercive measures. You're scared of your own people. He doesn't believe in the Bolshevik vanguard model because it tends to go with the notion of radical revolutionary change being led by a small elite, and Putin is terrified of radical revolutionary change. So in that respect, no. But in the respect of somebody who is, you say, enlightened, and I think we could say connected with sort of longer run historical perspectives with a bit of a mystical inflection, he thinks, yeah, as somebody connected to that, I am more Russia than the Russian population. They can just shut up and deal with it. Because they're all going to die, and nobody's going to care about what they thought, but everybody's going to care about what I did. Let's do just 9 more minutes, beautiful community. People say that the reason why Japan and Germany normalized after World War II was because they were occupied and because they lost. Does it mean that if a deal is made with Russia, we're just kicking the can down the road? Don't forget, Germany was a democracy before the Second World War in a deeper way than Russia ever was in the 90s. So there's more possibility of reversion there to where you were before than there is here. I do think it's very significant that, of course, there is no realistic prospect of occupying Russia. That does make a difference. What it really means is that we're going to have to deal with Russia. And we've got this very paradoxical situation where we're certainly not powerful enough to bring it about that we don't have to deal with whatever shape Russia is going to take. So we don't have the power to control that. We don't have the power to occupy Russia. But we also pretend as though we don't need to talk about dealing with the future Russia. Ukraine doesn't like to talk about that, which is interesting 4 years into the war, because you're tempted to say it's a mistake, but the problem is it also isn't a mistake, because if you start talking about dealing with Russia now in Ukraine, given the way the public discourse there has been framed, that's going to be very damaging, destabilizing. But the reality is we're very likely going to need to deal with Russia. We're very likely going to have to be accommodating of Russia's security demands, accommodating of Russia's needs in the future. And therefore, the best thing to do would be to put ourselves in the strongest possible position to get what we want out of that dynamic later. But we're not talking about it because talking about it would look weak. That's a paradox. I think in a populist age, it's time to start talking about it because your populations would get it. You just have to say, look, we're not going to occupy these folks. We're going to have to deal with the latest post-Putin incarnation that's going to emanate out of there. So let's talk about how we deal with it. Let's talk about how we're going to negotiate with them. Let's talk about what kind of security arrangements we want. Because at the moment, we've got this paradox whereby less on my channel, but certainly on the channels of my friends in this algorithmic bubble, there is the perception that we're not going to have to deal with Russia in the future, that's predicated on only one condition, that is that we can occupy Russia, but we can't. So we're going to have to deal with them. But so there's a contradiction there in that position, because you either have to occupy or you have to have a story about what your relationship is going to be with Russia in the medium term, right? So Ukraine is going to have a relationship with Russia. Ukraine is going to negotiate with Russia after the war, negotiate a dynamic with Russia. And we're going to have to do that too. And we're going to have to do things that Russia asks in return for Russia doing some things we ask. There's no way around that unless we occupy Russia. We're not strong enough to do that, but we're still pretending, we're still in this magical bubble, as though as though we can talk about Russia in a completely passive sense, without indeed having any capacity whatever to pacify it. So that's a paradox, and I think it's time for European leaders to wake up from that and tell us what their proposal is for what relationship France and the UK should have with the post-Putin Russia. Do I remember right that your full name is Vladislav? Yeah, as in it's Vladislav, it's not Vladimir, but I don't use that name. In other words, nobody calls me Vladislav. I don't relate to that. If somebody said Vladislav down the street, I might not turn around. I might think a bit talking about somebody else. Instinctively, I don't respond to that because I'm basically just Vlad. But I was born Vladislav. Will Putin annex Belarus? No. What's happening is a sort of a gradual confiscation of Belarusian sovereignty in a series of steps, but it doesn't require annexation. Don't forget, Putin never wanted and doesn't want to annex Ukraine either. He just wants political control over it, and like he prefers not to have it as part of the Russian Federation. Not sure if that's a troll question. Will Ukraine exist after the war? It's likely that Russia and Ukraine both exist after the war. Vlad, you need merch. Um, so I'm not a fan of merch because it's not a way to support my work. And also I don't love on a channel where I talk about neoliberalism endlessly to sell you mugs. But um, my partner a couple of years ago just ran a funny prototype, just did one bag, like a little material bag that said the beautiful community on it, and it looked ridiculously good actually. So we might just run an exemplar of like 10 or 20 for fun at some point. But it's not something I'm a big fan of. I'm not a fan of merch. You know, you've all got enough crap um, in your houses. You don't need more. Sell pictons. Oh yeah. As a proud owner of two pigs historically, and particularly one pig, my toy pig, I could sell toy pigs. Yes, I could become a toy pig salesman. I do think actually Picton would sell well. It's seriously an option then. George Carlin has a bit about how houses are just um, containers to keep our stuff in. It's about a 4 or 5 minute bit, I think. Um, so yeah, I'm not a fan of contributing to just stuff. Oh, Attila, worried. I'm worried. I'm not happy. How do you see the future of East European countries with less deeply rooted democratic cultures? I'm not happy. Um, I think that we're also screwed in the West. We've got this risk of democratic collapse, but I think that we've got a bit more resilience because of that uh, history of institutions dating back a long time. I do think that that makes a difference. I mean, I'm sitting on an island where we have long history of parliamentary democracy. We're talking about a couple of centuries, pretty much. That stuff makes a difference. It's harder for irresponsible clowns like Boris Johnson and Farage to just smash the whole show. Um, so I'm worried, but I'm also optimistic. I'm optimistic because um, what we're talking about are trends. But one country can say, well, look, um, we can't buck the trend of democratic decline, but we can buck the trend of those countries. Um, oh, somebody's repeating that George Carlin line: "My shit is stuff, and your stuff is shit." Um, you know, you can't buck the democratic decline trend, but if you're going to say that 20 or 30% of Western democracies are likely to collapse by 2040, then you can say, well, I'm going to make sure mine isn't one of them. So there's plenty of room for hope and plenty of room for agency here. And it's also not the case that when our democracies collapse, we're going to live under Stalinism. We're not. We're just not. We're going to live under Orbanite Hungary. Now, that's very difficult to reverse, but it's reversible also. So you could have a situation by 2040 where 20% of Western democracies have collapsed and then one of the collapsed democracies regains its democratic status by 2045. You know, so this is not a kind of a race where at the level of whether you get to keep your democracy, this is predetermined ahead of time. It's not. What's predetermined are the social forces putting a tendency on the table that we're all vulnerable to. We're all impacted by, and we can't just eliminate. We can just inflect it, soften it, but not remove it. But when it comes to the question of whether you actually lose your democracy, it's up to you. It's up to us. So with my health condition, I have no idea how long I'm gonna live and whether I'm gonna see the waves of democratic decline or democratic sustenance. I'm talking about in the medium term. But whatever country I am in, I am committed to my country remaining a democracy, right? As a big protagonist of the story of democratic decline, I'm committed to my country remaining a democracy. I don't have much power here, but in my infinitesimal role, I'll do what I can. So this is not inevitable stuff. In fact, it's better than that. If you're in a country with a very long democratic tradition and relatively robust institutions, your chance of keeping your democracy might be 50% or above. That's certainly worth fighting for, you know? Have you ever noticed that their stuff is shit and your shit is stuff? Um, I think we're going to stop. We went a little bit all over the place, but we did well. And I thought we had better questions and answers, but we thought we had 2 or 3 okay-ish answers. So we're going to stop. I promise we will talk about Hungary in the near future. I can see a few Hungary questions about Orban's prospects. But thank you. I can't believe, but I also can believe, but I also can't believe, but I also can believe that we're in year 5 of full-scale war. And the way it looks at the moment, there's going to be a year 6 as well. So lots of love, beautiful community. Talk very soon. And he's out of shot, but it's goodbye from Picton as well, who is there on the shelf. Lots of love and talk very soon.